Okay, welcome to the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable 2025 three-speaker fundraiser event, Queen Bess and Shakespeare. I'm Sylvia Holmes. The Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable has provided a safe forum to discuss varying views on the Shakespeare authorship question for 40 years. It's very important to us that our speakers feel welcome. Paraphrasing Aristotle, it is the mark of an educated mind to be able to entertain a thought without accepting it, and therefore let us keep an open mind. This is our 40th anniversary season, and thank you for joining us for this celebration. My mother, Barbara Crowley, started this group in 1985 with Carol Sue Lippman, who is still our president. Carol Sue, do you want to welcome everyone?
Yes, I'm so excited. We are starting our 40th season. Thank you all for coming today and for supporting the Shakespeare Authorship Roundtable. It's hard to believe that we've been offering this safe haven for over 40 years. The person who made me aware of this to believe, a reason to believe William Shakespeare may not be the man from Stratford, was a man named George Eliot Sweet, which I know some of you know about. And he believed actually that Queen Elizabeth was the woman behind the man. Since then, we have hosted many wonderful speakers and learned a lot about the Elizabethan period in England, other playwrights, other candidates. I am grateful to all of you who have participated through these years, and I look forward to future discoveries regarding the author or authors of the Shakespeare canon.
Okay, our first speaker is Nancy Peters Maude, who is an attorney. She will discuss Ralph Sheldon and his connections to Elizabeth, Leicester, and early court entertainment starting in 1566. In this study, she has followed the general principles of Harold Love in his work Attributing Authorship from 2002. Her previous such study was Thomas Lodge also Miso published in the Review of English Studies in 2017. Thank you and welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Sylvia. I am Nancy Peters Maude. I am here today because of my work on one man, Ralph Sheldon, a man born in 1537 in a tiny hamlet on the edge of the Forest of Arden, very near the heart of what is now known as Shakespeare country. I first encountered Sheldon over 13 years ago at the British Museum. Sheldon's magnificent silk tapestry maps were featured as part of an exhibit on Shakespeare's World. But I became quickly fixed on other items. To me, he stood out as the perfect generic Shakespeare. He was from Warwickshire. He was legally trained at Middle Temple, had 9 daughters, and owned hawks. But most importantly, he died in 1613 when the plays ended. And he had a clear rationale for a hidden identity. He was a prosecuted Catholic recusant. And as it happens, publishers of the first folio gave the first completed copy of the folio to Sheldon's family in 1623. There is a big catch, though. If Sheldon was Shakespeare, the clock for when the plays began has to be reset to the 1560s, to the very early years of Elizabeth's reign, decades earlier than traditionally assumed. Is this possible? This presentation concludes yes, and that Elizabeth herself was key to this early start to the Shakespeare canon. This lays out the theory that Shakespeare Theater began with Elizabeth's early collaboration with Robert Dudley, later Earl of Leicester, in the first 2 decades of her reign, after they engaged a brilliant young writer, Ralph Sheldon, in 1566 to create a repertory for the new English stage. This, of course, turns conventional wisdom on its head. Conventional wisdom would say that Shakespeare wrote, financed, and produced all his plays after a date of roughly 1588. And then conversely, that the early Elizabethan period, from about 1559 to 1583, produced little repertory of note and no illustrious playwright. So the question is, can this narrative be challenged? I would argue emphatically yes. To do so, I would point to one document, Francis Mere's Palladis Tamina, a book that offers what seems to be an irrefutable date. Meres published this book in 1598, and in it listed 12 plays by the most excellent Shakespeare. Thus, by 1598, all 12 plays must have been written, produced, and performed under the name of Shakespeare. The list of these plays is shown in Chart 1. Consider the conventional narrative. By this, the young man from Stratford first produced Henry VI, Part 1, around 1588. But from there, the canon had to grow explosively. Those plays listed by Meres, comedies like Midsummer's Night's Dream, histories like Richard III, tragedies like Romeo and Juliet, all must have been produced under the actor's name sometime in the 1590s before 1598. Then, in addition to the 12 plays named by Meres, at least 6 other Shakespeare plays were also produced and performed in the 1590s. The Henry VI trilogy, As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Merry Wives of Windsor. By this narrative, the young actor produced 18 masterworks in roughly a decade. At the same time, he published Venus and Adonis, The Rape of Lucrece, and he wrote his sonnets. And all the while, he kept his day job as an actor. Is this possible? Could any playwright, regardless of education or class, have written and produced so much so quickly? I would offer an alternative theory. What if, instead of the plays erupting in one big bang in one decade, the Shakespeare repertory evolved over several decades, beginning with the early years of Elizabeth's reign? What do we know of the repertory of that period? First and foremost, we know that Elizabeth, like her father and grandfather before her, loved a good interlude. We also know that for the first 2 decades of her reign, she relied primarily on 2 men, Robert Dudley and Sebastian Westcott, to produce her court entertainment. As Princess Elizabeth, her first official event was at Hatfield House in 1551, where at age 18, she hosted a performance by the Children's Halls produced by Westcott. She remained close with Westcott for the next 30 years until his death in 1582. But Elizabeth's main partner in English drama was Dudley, a childhood friend and a dynamic impresario. She collaborated with him on transforming English drama from the beginning of her reign, and Dudley established his own troupe of actors around May 1559. Leicester's Men, as they were later known, performed not only at court, but also in public playhouses around London, and they toured extensively throughout the countryside. No matter how talented the producers, drama depends on its repertory. And at the beginning of her reign, Elizabeth had almost none. For the most part, what was there of the sparse repertory was limited to staid morality plays. So, how was a monarch to both expand the repertory and keep the quality of the scripts. To this problem, Elizabeth offered a different solution than that of her sister Mary. Whereas Mary simply banned interludes outright unless they were approved by her, Elizabeth focused on the playwrights. In May 1559, she decreed that henceforth all plays and interludes would be written by men of authority, learning, and wisdom. This fiat seems to have set the tone for her entire reign. In the early years, much of the new repertory came from the gentlemen of the Inns of the Court, but once the universities expanded their reach, the highly regarded university wits dominated the stage. In the first 2 decades of her reign, the volume of repertory grew steadily. 3 troupes, that is 2 boy troupes, the Children of Paul's and the Children of the Chapel Royal, as well as the adult troupe, Leicester's Men, performed over 60 plays at court. After 1583, however, all these troupes stopped performing regularly at court. The records on this entire repertory are definitely scant, but one particular time period stands out. In the 16 years between 1567 and 1583, about 50 plays were staged at court by the 3 principal troupes. None of these plays, however, has an identified playwright, and only 2 are associated with printed texts. This gap is pronounced if you compare plays produced both before and after. Playwright John Heywood worked with Westcott during the 1550s, Richard Edwards with the Chapel Royal between 1561 and 1566, and John Lyly at court with Oxford Boys after 1583. All 3 of these playwrights have printed plays tied to their performances. This gap becomes even more significant if one adds the public performances by Leicester's Men. In 1574, the Queen authorized this company alone to stage plays throughout England, and in 1576, the company opened its first standalone public playhouse on the outskirts of London. Much to the dismay of the city authorities, these performances brought boisterous mass audiences to London. However, notwithstanding the great popularity of these plays, there is no record at all of the plays. There's no names, there's no text, and there's no playwright. Where did all this repertory go? Did it simply vanish? Did the dramatist just abandon his scripts? But even if we don't know where this repertory went, we do have good evidence of performances of Shakespeare plays before 1590. The first clue to these performances is found in the Mere's List itself. Of the 12 plays, only one, A Midsummer's Night Dream, can be verified as first produced in the 1590s. None of the rest have proof of an initial production in that decade. So, if they were not first performed in the 8 years before 1598, when were these 11 plays first on stage? Contemporaneous accounts provide specific evidence of early stage performances for some of the Mere's List plays and other early plays. Poet Arthur Brooke reported on a version of Romeo and Juliet staged around 1560. Critic Stephen Gosson wrote of a play named The Jew on stage in 1578. The title of a court play from 1577, Titus and Giuseppus, reflects the original names of the 2 main characters of the gentleman from Verona. Circumstances surrounding the court performance of History of Eyre in the same year, 1577, strongly indicate an early version of Comedy of Errors. Similar evidence is available for at least 2 plays not on the Mears list. Hamlet appears to have had multiple performances by 1589, according to commentary by Thomas Nash. The original source of Much Ado About Nothing was a French novella published in 1574 with a heroine named Phoenicia. This seems tied to the title of a play produced at the end of the same year, Phoenicia. And then there are the so-called source plays, plays whose plot structure and historic sources closely match early Shakespeare plays. Such plays include The Troublesome Reign of King John, The Famous Victories of Henry V, and The True Tragedy of Richard III. These plays tightly parallel Shakespeare's King John, Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, Henry V, and Richard III, all of which are early history plays, and except for Henry V, are included on the Mears list. These 3 source plays were printed, and all 3 were performed by the Queen's Men, the troupe which replaced Leicester's Men as the court troupe in 1583. Numerous eminent scholars of the mid-20th century, such as Geoffrey Bullough, Kenneth Muir, and Dover Wilson, have recognized these source plays, and others, such as King Lear, that's Leir, Taming of Aeshrew, as well as the lost play of Richard II, as clear antecedents of the Shakespeare plays. In all, if one considers evidence of the contemporary commentaries, the title similarities, and the source plays, at least 13 of the early Shakespeare plays can be associated with performances prior to 1590, and some specifically to the 1570s. These include 9 of the 11 Mears plays that have no record of a first performance in the 1590s. Most modern scholars, such as Anderger and others, do not deny the existence of these early plays. Rather, they simply assume that the Stratford man found the old plays, rewrote them, and produced them under his own name without credit to the original playwright. There is, however, no factual evidence to show when or how, as a practical matter, the young actor could possibly have reclaimed these earlier plays as his own. Did he merely discover, say, Romeo and Juliet in a playhouse bin and subsequently convince the playhouse owner that he, the young actor, should produce the play again, but as his own? Given the acknowledged existence of these earlier plays, is there room for another theory? What if, instead of a plagiarist, the immensely talented playwright Shakespeare was an early pioneer of English drama, and these early plays were simply first versions of what later became Shakespeare plays? Wit and Will, first performed in 1567 by the Children of Paul's, trademark Shakespeare, with the character Will being the prototype for numerous variations in early Shakespeare comedies, including the Comedy of Errors. Furthermore, the dating of the early history plays, which are derived from the early source plays, is far more compatible with the events of the 1570s. That is, the aftermath of the Northern Lords' Rebellion and the papal excommunication of Elizabeth than later decades. In 1574, Elizabeth gave Leicester's Men a license to produce plays throughout England. What better plays than the early Shakespeare history plays to promote Tudor monarchy? Both sets of plays, those produced by the boy actors and those by Leicester's Men, were exceedingly popular. Both groups set up separate public playhouses apart from the court. Boisterous audiences eventually caused city authorities to shut down these playhouses. Might not the plays that drew such enthusiastic audiences to these playhouses, particularly to the public playhouses operated by Leicester's Men, might not they have been early versions of blockbuster hits like Hamlet or Henry V. But if this early repertory was in fact never lost and instead included such early versions of Shakespeare masterpieces, who was the anonymous writer? At this point, let me reintroduce Ralph Sheldon, the man whose family was given the first published complete copy of the folio. Sheldon provides a link between the early repertory and the modern Shakespeare works. In August 1566, Leicester hosted Elizabeth at her first official visit to Oxford University. In the run-up to the visit, Leicester set up Sheldon in a 60-year lease to a residence at a rural outpost of Oriel College, Oxford, where rehearsals were held for the play to be staged for the Queen. The play, Palamon and Arcite, was written by the noted court dramatist Richard Edwards. After a triumphant reception for his play, Edwards died suddenly in October 1566. Thereafter, the record on any court playwright for the next 16 years went blank, yet the plays continued. So who remained as the court dramatist? Nominally, Edwards was replaced by William Hunnes, a stalwart Protestant, formerly the Queen's gardener at Greenwich, a man who has never been found to have written a line of stage dialogue in his life. Similarly, the other two men who produced plays for the Queen between 1567 and 1583, Westcott and Richard Ferrant, were not known as writers. This conspicuously leaves Sheldon as the likely playwright. Of great significance, Sheldon's position as a recusant Catholic in the Protestant reign of Elizabeth provides a reasonable explanation for the secrecy shrouding the identity of Elizabeth's head playwright. Public acknowledgement of the Catholic Sheldon would have invited political scandal. For Elizabeth and Leicester, openly crediting a known papist recusant as their chief dramatist would have been untenable, even suicidal. Anonymity and obfuscation were far safer. Hence, the mysterious gap in court records between 1567 and 1583. One of the most striking aspects of Shakespeare plays is the intricate plot construction taken from bits and pieces of various identifiable sources, some both rare and esoteric. This, I would argue, is a critical test of anyone proposed to be Shakespeare. To be the writer, a person must have had access to even the most esoteric of these sources. For example, the gravedigger scene in Hamlet is widely recognized as derived from the legal holding in a 1561 judicial case, Hales v. Pettit, published in 1571 as part of case reports written in Norman French by an eminent Catholic jurist, Edmund Plowden. To this, Sheldon had unique access. Plowden was his brother-in-law, a fellow member of Middle Temple, and the co-executor of the estate of William Sheldon, Ralph's wealthy father, in the 1570s. Similarly, esoteric sources underpin other early plays and are similarly tied to Sheldon. In addition to Hamlet, plots of three other plays, King John, Richard II, The Merchant of Venice, were all constructed using Plowden's legal writings, including manuscripts from the 1560s. A rare volume of Hall's Chronicle, edition 1550, has annotations in handwriting matching Sheldon's own that track the early plots of Henry IV and V. Merchant of Venice includes details of Jewish merchants in Venice, unknown in England, but familiar to Sheldon from his trip to Italy in 1556 on behalf of his family's silk tapestry business. These merchants handled the foreign silk imports into Italy. The same 1556 trip included Verona, then the major export center for Italian silk, the locale for both The Gentlemen of Verona and Romeo and Juliet. An obscure 1591 manuscript advocating silk cultivation in England, a topic of great relevance to Sheldon's business, retold the story of Pyramus and Thisbe, the playlet performed in A Midsummer's Night Dream. The Shakespeare play closely tracked the pamphlet, with the lead actor Bottom the Weaver, Bottom a term for silkworm cocoon, and Fairies, Moth, and Cobweb. Two novellas by Francois de Belfort, published in 1570s, were the basis for Hamlet and Much Ado About Nothing. The first English translation of Belfort's novellas was published in 1577, translated by a writer R.S., as in Ralph Sheldon. These examples sharply overlap with the Mere's plays and other early plays. In a comparison, Sheldon can be tied directly to 8 of the 12 Mere's plays, 4 of which are also considered source plays, such as Henry V, Hamlet, Much Ado About Nothing. But behind Sheldon, as the master dramatist, lay the dynamic collaboration between the Queen and Leicester to promote English drama throughout England. Leicester, though, disappeared from court entertainments around 1583, replaced by Francis Walsingham and his Queen's Men. As able as Walsingham was as a court administrator, it is well understood that he had limited, if any, interest in stage drama. Thus, to the extent that Elizabeth herself transformed the English drama scene, it would have been most effectively done with her longtime ally Leicester in the first 2 decades of her reign, with Sheldon emerging as the hidden hand behind the plays later credited to Shakespeare. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nancy. Our second speaker is Michael Delahoyde. Dr. Delahoyde is Scholarly Professor Emeritus of English at Washington State University. Michael will examine Queen Elizabeth Portraiture and uncover some delightful surprises connected to Edward de Vere and Shakespeare. Michael is the editor of Twelfth Night, an Oxfordian edition, and Antony and Cleopatra, an Oxfordian edition, as well as many articles on the Shakespeare authorship question. Thank you and welcome, Michael.
And I should say from the start, there are certainly people here who know more about this than I do, but I think there are some other features that are bizarre about the whole phenomenon of portraiture when it comes to Elizabeth that more should know about. Here is an example of the fact that all of these portraits are at least propaganda and sometimes a little more allegorical too. So here is the family of Henry VIII. There in the middle, I think they're missing 120 pounds of him, but it's flattering. And we've got on the left, for our left, Philip of Spain and Mary bringing in allegorically war and strife, because there's that Catholic problem. But on the right, and correct, is Elizabeth bringing in allegorically peace and prosperity. Here is another similar one, which has Mary on our left and Elizabeth on our right. And this one has Henry with little Prince Edward, eventually Edward VI, and Jane Seymour. Problem here is that she was dead not long after the birth of Edward. So really this is a kind of a fantasy therapeutic image to restore the family itself. I'm convinced that The Winter's Tale, where the traditional explanation has something to do with the son of James I, and we get into the 1600s. Yeah, but you've got a tyrant king. He accuses his wife of the same things that Henry VIII accused Anne Boleyn of, puts her on trial, and she ends up dying. You've got a kid who is the great hope, like Prince Edward, who dies too. And then the disowning of the daughter, Perdita, that is Elizabeth's story, really. But Shakespeare gives the gift of this restoration at the end where mommy comes back some mysterious way. There's restoration of the daughter and the father. The kid's still dead. And the only argument there is, yeah, but where's Mary? So that doesn't work. But of course, there is no Mary because she is always marginalized because we don't like her. This one's adorbs. It was painted some years after she actually uh, gained the throne and crown. But we decided we needed something to commemorate that moment because it looks like she's in for the long haul. And this is an early painting of her, propagandistic insofar as we are celebrating the Tudor rose, that variegated red and white rose, the white Yorkist and the red Lancastrian joining forces under the reprehensible Henry VII. And I'm sure this is 101 material, but this image is the problem, and I think you all can list the reasons, right? That how do you get a body in there with a shoulder that's going to anyway match up a neck that I do not want to see connecting that head from that to that body, and the perspective being weird. The left front of his tunic is actually the right back, say the experts, but it doesn't take an expert to look at this and say, yeah, that's all wonky. The buttons are backwards too. There's a button at the top that doesn't connect anything. His hair looks weird. The defense is, well, maybe that was stage hair. Maybe it was a wig that he put on and a glob of an ear underneath that and this glowing thing on his head that's, I guess that you can say is, it's Shakespeare's brain. It's like just striving to get out. And I just think Tylenol, I don't care what they say. Uh, but the experts also look at the lines about his eyes and say, that is not the way we want him to look, but it is more correct anatomically. The poem facing this in the first folio is by Ben Jonson, whose bottom line is literally, look not on his picture, but his book. And so, of course, we want to look at his picture and find more things wrong with it. Most, I think, weird is the fact that he's got this stubble. And it's hard to get students to understand. He didn't show up like this any years after his death, and we just didn't have Photoshop. No, you have to put in an extra month to do the little plates with the dots, all this, just to make them look seedy, and then spread the ink and slap it down. So either look at the monument and say, okay, well, he had a mustache, or make him clean shaven. Either way, it's a heck of a lot easier. But most of all, people point out the line extending down beneath his ear, underneath his chin, suggesting what? A mask. And I think once you see this as a mask plastered onto some face with the eyes peering out and pushing the hair back, it looks plastic, it looks fake, and you can't unsee it. Well, so what? Ooh, she's pretty. Who's that? It's not generally acknowledged that that is a remarkable match, better than my crude attempt there. So what's the explanation? Well, Queen Elizabeth is Shakespeare. I was at a early workshop for technology in teaching, and there was a guy next to me just learning how to download images off the web. But he noticed that I was into Shakespeare, and he was a specialist in Tudor times. And he said, "Oh, come here, this will interest you. That notice how all these images of Elizabeth are basically the same. And this is because, and I've since confirmed it, we've got a face pattern situation here. In other words, when Elizabeth was 30, she issued a royal proclamation regulating production of her portraits. She would make one portrait and then have a template generated from that. and artists would have to follow the template. This is probably because of her vanity. She never aged for most of these portraits. And the Elizabethan era is also called the first efficient police state. So, as Janet Jackson sang so eloquently so many years ago, control. Also, she could not have the time to sit for all the portraits, especially when the demand was high in those years. So, when you look at the portraits, you're going to see the same thing again and again. This has been determined as the one that provided the face pattern, and I don't know why they say that unless somehow the process would demand that you flip her face the other way, because all the portraits that are generated from this, she's facing the other way. And indeed, she doesn't really age, and her nose is always quite familiar, and you can dress her up in anything you like. And they do think that these are authentic Elizabeth's clothes, but probably she would have one of her maids sit for the portrait, and then they'd plant her face in afterwards, always in the same direction. Now, here she is celebrating how great and sunny a day it is for the English fleet and how crappy it is for the Spanish Armada. Too bad she won the war. Ha ha. There was eventually some censorship about these portraits. So there are apparently some that snuck out and had to be rounded up and burned. And here's one that's kind of an oddity, the Ditchley. It's odd because there are some signs of her aging, although I don't think very much. And there's some kind of politics about her standing on Oxford. but but here is another interesting one. This escaped the censors, and this was authenticated some years ago. And they authenticated it based on the fact that her dress and the jewels are identical to this one. But she is clearly in her later years, and that wouldn't have gone well had she known about it. And similarly, this one, but this was painted many years after her death. Couldn't tell you why, except just a last posthumous tribute to her in her weary years. Uh-oh. We got to come up with excuses why this is not Elizabeth. But the problem is that this is called the Persian portrait, and what's we're seeing here is heavily symbolic. And those who think, no, it's her, but somehow somebody got away with this commission, shows her crowning a weeping stag with a garland of pansies. And pansies is a bit of a rabbit hole when it comes to Shakespeare. We know that the Virgin Queen, that was a state policy. Was it a biological fact? Some will scream to their grave, yeah, absolutely, but it's spurious. If we don't know that she was a virgin, do we know for certain that she wasn't a mother ever? Well, all kinds of objections to that, yes. But Charles Beauclerk notes that throughout Shakespeare, this myth of Actaeon, seeing the naked goddess Diana when he's walking through the woods accidentally, being turned into a stag as his punishment, that informs Shakespeare again and again. Now, we know that Ovid's Metamorphoses is Shakespeare's favorite book, and he will address particular myths at certain times, but this one is woven in a weirder way. So is it possible that this is actually the succession theory or Prince Tudor theory? And I just do not want to be categorized in that camp. But when little things get explained, I don't want to bury them either. So I don't know what to do with all this necessarily. But in Twelfth Night especially, you've got this Olivia character who sometimes lapses into the royal we, even though she's just Lady Olivia. or a countess maybe. But you hear all this royal language. Do usurp yourself, she is told, for what is yours to bestow is not yours to reserve. And it's inappropriate for wooing, but basically this is the same message in the first 17 sonnets that you need to breed. You are the cruelest she alive if you would lead these graces to the grave and leave the world no copy. As I say, she acts and is treated like a princess, lapses into the royal way, is associated with the red and white Tudor colors again, is called Madonna, not that one, and the go-between between O Orsino and Lady Olivia Elizabeth is Cesario, meaning the little king, associated with pansies and violets, and those and Viola is the name here. This character, Viola, tells Lady Olivia, what I am and what I would as secret as maidenhead, to your ears divinity, to any other's profanation. Now, if Elizabeth actually did have a child, and that child were given a voice, and she were insisting that she is the Virgin Queen, then the maidenhead is essential as a secret and divine. She is actively taking the role that we booted Mary, the Virgin Mary, out of when Catholicism got whooshed away and we put in the Protestant idea, and that Mariology was just too much. So that would be the case. But to others thinking, oh, she had a kid, she's sexually active, that would be profanation. If Viola represents something that really is a go-between O and Olivia. We keep hearing about wise men in this play, and you wonder about the title, Twelfth Night. What's that got to do with anything? Oh, it's the Lord of Misrule and it's a fun time. Shut up. Get something real here. Twelfth Night is the epiphany where we recognize the birth of the new king, the world powers. It's not the birth of him, but it's the recognition of his kingship. So the virgin had a child. So is it possible that Oxford might have said, hey, Elizabeth, I know you're preserving this virgin queen myth, but you can still do that and acknowledge that you had a kid. And Twelfth Night would be the acknowledgement of this, finally, something that never happened. All right, here's another one. How did this slip through? This was unearthed from a museum some years ago, not too long ago, and it's been discolored through the ages. But they also thought, what is she holding on to there? It looks like a bunch of flowers or something, a little bouquet. So they decided to x-ray it. And it turned out it had been painted over. She's holding a serpent, but someone decided that's wrong. We had to paint it over. They reconstructed it like that. Looks like a horse snake to me. But what's the explanation? Snakes, they seem to be bad. But here's the rainbow portrait, something that I also don't really understand the rainbow part of. Why is there a tube going to her crotch? I couldn't tell you. But her gown is covered with eyes and ears, and she's got this serpent embroidered on her sleeve, too. So it's generally assumed that the idea here is that she has got eyes and ears and she is slithering along the ground and she is the wisdom side of the snake is perhaps the mythology. But you're not going to get away with anything in this police state. So maybe the serpent is okay in that regard, but that's a lot of overturning of the typical myth. So what's the explanation for this? And maybe it's logical that they would want to paint it over because it's so weird. But who would have commissioned it to begin with and think it was a good idea? Well, who holds a serpent here? Mythologically, Cleopatra does. And there is that extra weird scene in Antony and Cleopatra where this clown figure comes in with the figs. We didn't need to make a big deal of this. He could have just brought the figs. Oh, I die and meet Anthony and just kill yourself. But they have this exchange, and this guy becomes tedious, insisting that the biting of the serpent is immortal. That's his mistake for his biting is mortal. But it's a good mistake because Cleopatra ends up immortal. Queen Elizabeth ends up immortal. And the worm's an odd worm, he keeps saying too. Worm is an odd term for this at this time. You can get the word worm in Anglo-Saxon in Beowulf, meaning a dragon, but our modern sensibilities say, no, worm is a little gross thing you put on a hook. And the clown keeps saying, I wish you all the joy of the worm, joy of the worm. Worms and worm is a key term for Shakespeare a lot. And it's because it's probably at root, as it were, another name clue. So Shakespeare likes to play with Vere. Primrose, the firstborn child of Vere, is pretty startling at the beginning of a song in Two Noble Kinsmen. Firstborn child. But also vermin, the Romance language source for that. Here's an example of this being used as a name clue. So Benedict and Beatrice are finally acknowledging that they love each other. And when did you first love me? And oh. And then they take this detour that is usually left out of productions because, as always, the key stuff is nonsensical and gets excised. But Benedict says, well, we're too wise to woo peaceably. And Beatrice says, wise people don't say that they're wise. Benedict retorts, it's more expedient for the wise, if Don worm his conscience, find no impediments to the contrary, to be the trumpet of his own virtues, as I am to myself. So Don Worm, and it seems as if in the Renaissance, maybe that was like a standard little trope where, the worm is gnawing at you, not your conscience. But if that were the case, I've never heard of it anywhere else. Why would you have to translate it in parentheses anyway? Well, Don in the same play, there's Don John, sometimes called Count John, and we know that on the continent they kept Count and Countess, but in England they retained the old Anglo-Saxon Earl for that title. And then you've got the worm Vere again. So it seems as if there's this anxiety that, as Shakespeare says, my name was going to be buried, so I'm going to sneak it in. So here then, if we've got the worm, at the very least, it's that joy of the worm, de Vere, joy of the worm is de Vere, immortalizing Elizabeth. So I've got to think the only explanation for this portrait would be that it's a companion piece for the presentation of Antony and Cleopatra, which is so much a tribute to the relationship between the Earl of Oxford and Queen Elizabeth, who gets immortalized through that play and through the Shakespeare canon. When Bottom comes out of his, he thinks, dream, not certain what the experience was, he says, I had a most rare vision, had a dream past the wit of man to say what dream it was. You got to be an ass if you go around to expound this dream. Methought I was, there's no man can tell what, methought I was and methought I had. But you got to be a jerk if you're going to say what I thought I had. And some of the wrong productions of this, I thought I had, and he reaches up like he had ass's ears. No, Bottom never knew he had ass's ears. Methought I was the consort to the fairy queen, another term for Elizabeth, in the woods. Methought I had an affair with the fairy queen, the virgin queen, in the woods. But you got to be an idiot if you're going to say that in public. What can you do? Sing it at the latter end of a play. So you can put it into a play, not directly, but hint at it in the art. And I think most of us believe that that's what Shakespeare did all through. So all the joy of the worm, his biting is immortal, seems to have worked pretty well. And Queen Elizabeth still has a pretty good reputation in all of this. Finally, though, here she is. My resolutions placed, she says, that is Cleopatra says, when she's decided she's got to be immortalized, she's got to die. My resolution's placed, and I have nothing of woman in me now from head to foot. I am marble constant. Now the fleeting moon is no planet of mine. And the moon was always associated with Elizabeth too, as with Diana, the virgin goddess. At the end of A Midsummer Night's Dream, the Duke enigmatically says to the players, no epilogue, I pray you, for your play needs no excuse. Never excuse, for when the players are all dead, there need none to be blamed. And no one really knows what to do with that exactly. All I can say is it seems like some of these other lines to rise out of the play, and we have to realize all the players are dead. Elizabeth, Burleigh, Oxford, Marlowe, everybody's gone. So now what do we do? So that was my show.
And thank you so much, Michael. Our third speaker is Kristin Bundesen. Dr. Bundesen serves as Associate Dean for the College of Interdisciplinary Undergraduate Studies at Walden University. She is a trustee of the Shakespearean Authorship Trust in the UK and edits their Substack. Kristin will present Elizabethan Theater as a family business where the Queen was head of production. She contributed 10 articles to a biographical encyclopedia of early modern English women, exemplary lives and memorable acts, 1500 to 1650. Thank you and welcome, Kristin.
I'm pleased to be here. Thank you for attending. This is my first presentation for the SAR, but I've attended a few times and really appreciate the open-mindedness and safe space. This presentation is an abbreviated version of a much longer presentation on this subject, which in turn also serves as the basic outline for the last chapter in a book that's long overdue. So I thank you for allowing me to take the material out for some air. Today's panel is titled Queen Bess, Is There a Shakespeare Without Her? And I might posit that there wouldn't have been an Elizabethan age without Elizabeth's family, specifically her non-royal family, who were deployed across all areas of the kingdom's government, including the mass media of the day. Elizabeth ruled for 45 years, and over the course of her reign, English theater transformed from religious ritual to commercial entertainment, and one family helped orchestrate that transformation. Why would a monarch, or to be more extreme and traditionalist, a cantankerous virgin queen, be interested in theater as anything other than personal entertainment, anything other than her version of streaming media? In many ways, it was streaming in that the queen, as the audience, determined when and where performances began and ended, at her command, at her click. So these are some of the topics I'll be touching on today. Elizabeth's reign is called a golden age, part of the Northern Renaissance, and or the Shakespearean age. And the factors that create a golden age include political stability, relative prosperity, technological innovation, trade, development of urban centers, and a high degree of societal confidence. Theater, popular entertainment in general, was and still is an effective messaging medium. Art and literature flourish in golden ages, but they are also strictly controlled in more repressive regimes. The other convenient messaging medium can be the church. Both the church and live performance reach across social and economic classes, both in the 16th century and in many aspects of the 21st. Both religious ceremony and live performance took place at court and across the kingdom. By the Elizabethan Church of England time, parish churches received state-approved sermons and read out official notices from the government. It was a convenient kingdom-wide broadcast system. This picture is from a ballet performed by the Bolshoi during the Soviet era. The story follows an Armenian woman named Gayan, whose patriotism is tested by her husband's treason. The ballet was designed to inspire and uplift the Soviet people during wartime. After the 1917 revolution, the Bolshoi Ballet turned into one of the Soviet Union's most powerful propaganda tools, demonstrating the superiority of communist culture on the world stage. The Bolshoi became entirely state-controlled. The company performed classical ballets like Swan Lake and Giselle to prove Soviet artists could master bourgeois European culture, while also premiering socialist realist ballets glorifying workers, collective farms, and revolutionary heroes. In a completely different government setting, Laurence Olivier's 1944 film of Henry V was commissioned by the British government as wartime propaganda to boost morale during World War II. The film's portrayal of English triumph against overwhelming odds at Agincourt deliberately paralleled Britain's situation fighting Nazi Germany. Olivier omitted scenes that showed Henry's darker actions, like ordering the prisoners killed, proving that theater's messaging function never disappears. And as a scholar with a degree in theater and a doctorate in history, I view President Trump's takeover of the Kennedy Center and the funding cuts to the National Endowment of the Arts and Humanities as distressing signs of potential things to come. So although I'm not marching in the streets today, I'm glad to hear that those are going swimmingly. But before there was a Shakespeare or an English Renaissance or a Golden Age, there were church-sponsored and sanctioned miracle plays, mystery plays, and morality plays. And these are sometimes lumped together as one big M group of plays. The mystery plays portrayed Bible stories. These entertainments were performed by the craft guilds and sometimes were produced in a cycle covering many days, and they were accompanied by music, frequently of a liturgical nature. Think of the creation, Judgment Day, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Isaac, Cain and Abel, the raising of Lazarus as plots. And the city of York was famous for their mystery cycles. But in this format, the church controlled the message, the space, and the meaning. These plays follow a set form. They can be viewed as a teaching mechanism, showing the public how best to adhere to contemporary definitions of living a life of faith, godliness, and morality. But what happens when the church fractures and the monarchy vacillates between differing theologies? What happens if the church struggles to retain preeminence in people's lives? Is the church best positioned to advocate for a particular way of living and a particular reverence for those in power, be they clerical or secular? So a central question becomes, how did theater evolve from the intellectual property of the church to what I consider to be royal family business? So brief history for those of you who are a little fuzzy pre-Shakespeare. Here's a quick little history catch-up. After Henry VIII's break from Rome, Protestant plays and interludes emerge, promoting Reformed religion. John Bayle's polemical Protestant dramas represents a transitional moment between medieval religious drama and Elizabethan commercial theater. Unlike the humanistic drama that would emerge later, Bayle's plays were unsubtle propaganda pieces designed to attack Catholic practices, demonize the Pope, and promote Henry VIII's break from Rome. He essentially pioneered the model of theater as political messaging. Perhaps his best known play may be King John or Johann, circa 1538, which transformed an unpopular medieval king into a righteous reformer, creating a direct parallel to Henry VIII's struggle against Rome. But Bayle's work was too crude, too explicitly partisan, and too religiously inflammatory to survive into Elizabeth's reign. What we do not have time to discuss today is the evolution of humanistic education that's also part of the Northern Renaissance and the role that that humanistic education flourishing created in inventing the human, with apologies to Bloom. As an historian, I'm having problems with humanistic education and the university wits serving as a model for an individual genius from Stratford for which there is no historical evidence of any education at all. When Elizabeth came to the throne, while she was obviously the next heir, she was still an unmarried woman of a different religion than the previous one, with unknown policies. In fact, her only known policy for the previous 11 years had been to stay alive, unmarried, and remain in England. She knew not to bludgeon her personal theology onto her subjects, as her sister, brother, and father had done. So her threading of the spiritual and theological needle in her religious settlement as a statement of peace, or at least détente, strikes me as artful governing. Overtly explicit religious drama was banned. Bale's polemical plays were exactly what she wanted to avoid, whereas allegory and ambiguity allow exploration of complex questions without explicitly taking sides. This is especially helpful when dealing with censors, for example. Oh, you thought it meant that? No, no, no. Commercial and secular theater could develop. This policy of calculated ambiguity created the space for Elizabethan theater to flourish. It just needed patrons, government sanction, economic opportunity, and talented creators to support this theatrical transformation. So let's look at what family I am concerned with. For those of you who don't know me, it's the Careys. For those of you who do know me, you knew I was talking about the Careys. The Careys were Elizabeth's non-royal family, and as such, they owed their prominence and power solely to her. They were not in a position to challenge her authority or put themselves forward as potential heirs to the throne. So who are they? Well, Anne Boleyn and Mary Boleyn are sisters. Henry has an affair with Mary before he meets Anne. Mary's husband is William Carey, a groom of the chamber. Mary names her children, a boy and a girl, after the king and his then current first wife, Catherine of Aragon. And the children use Mary's husband's surname, as was the law of the land and expectation. They were well cared for by the king, though. Young Henry Carey joins Princess Elizabeth's household. His sister Catherine is appointed as lady-in-waiting to Henry's fourth wife, Anne of Cleves. And Catherine marries and meets, under Anne of Cleves' very short time, Sir Francis Knowles, a rising court administrator. When the Princess Elizabeth is in trouble during her brothers and sisters' reigns, Henry Carey lends her money. He meets his wife, Anne Morgan, in her household, and he becomes known as, quote, a fast man to his prince. Henry and Anne Morgan have a daughter, also named unhelpfully Catherine, and this Catherine marries Charles Howard. Henry and Anne Morgan have a son named George, who ends up inheriting his father's titles and his acting company. And this is just a small, very small smattering of their titles. So now we have the major commercial theater players we've come to know and love in the last half of Elizabeth's reign. Henry Carey is Lord Chamberlain of the Lord Chamberlain's Men. When he dies, his son George becomes Lord Chamberlain and keeps the acting company. And Henry's son-in-law, George's brother-in-law, is the Lord Admiral of the Lord Admiral's Men. And side note, Henry Carey takes as his mistress the poet Amelia Bassano. As with many noble households of the day, the Hunsdons patronized several creators and promoted the arts and letters, recognizing the value they bring to their own prestige and as a way to connect with wider diplomatic and economic interests. Charles Howard and Catherine Carey Howard become the epitome of the Elizabethan power couple. They have the titles and the wealth because as the Lord Admiral, he was entitled to a percentage of every privateer and pirate ship's cargo. Catherine was the Queen's dear friend and served her until her death in 1603. Catherine's brother George married Elizabeth Spencer from Althorp, who is an ancestor of Princess Diana and Winston Churchill. Elizabeth Spencer Carey ran a 16th century version of a salon, much the way Mary Sidney, Countess of Pembroke, did. In fact, another presentation for another day would be the role women played in developing humanistic education outside the university setting. Papa Spencer was the richest agriculturalist in England at the time, so while Elizabeth Spencer wasn't royal, George's marriage to her was very advantageous. They were very rich. The family was much admired for their husbandry. Elizabeth spoke several languages and was a poet herself. And one of her cousins was Edmund Spencer of the Fairy Queen. Like many well-bred and noble ladies, she was very well educated. She also patronized or received dedications from Thomas Churchyard, Thomas Nash, Abraham Glemming, Henry Locke, and the musician John Dowland. The point being that support of creators was a family enterprise, not solely a male-dominated one. Also in the family by marriage was Ferdinando Stanley, Lord Strange, Earl of Derby, who married Elizabeth Spencer Carey's sister Alice. I know you feel like you need a playing card to keep track of these people. I'm sorry. From the late 1570s onwards, the Stanleys patronized a company of players, strange as men, and this was just part of the fashion of aristocratic and noble families creating household entertainment companies that could be sent to tour their lands and generate goodwill. Writers patronized by Alice and Ferdinando included John Davies of Hereford, John Harrington, Henry Locke, John Marston, Green, Nash, and dear cousin Spencer. After Ferdinando's death, Alice kept the company going for a while, and then it was absorbed into her sister and brother-in-law's company, which is to say that the company stayed in the family. This is the basic structure of an increasingly centralized government during the reign of Elizabeth. Out of these four areas flowed the emerging structure of national and local government, and what is missing from this picture is the church. This is intentional, as the church was moved away from its position as central to social control and political governance. The Church of England developed into a type of national club with compulsory membership. If you didn't belong, you were fined, sometimes jailed, and sometimes accused of treason. But for Elizabeth, it was not the differing theologies of her subjects that annoyed her, but any claim by any person or institution that challenged her right and ability to rule. In this, she was much like her father. And this is referred to as the points of contact because none of these branches of government work without direct contact with the monarch. With Elizabeth I at the center of the kingdom and as the ultimate decision maker, access to the monarch was imperative for the running of the kingdom. And here's how a family, a kinship network, could be deployed across the Elizabethan government, starting with, I don't know, the Queen's cousin, Henry Carey, who I believe to be her half-brother. You can query me about that later. Family members populated all 4 points of contact to an astonishing degree. They also held within their gift several church appointments. Consider that there were 103 members of this kinship network alive during Elizabeth's reign. That's a pretty deep bench to pull your governmental staff from. Theater was not universally embraced by local and regional administrators as a good thing. Recalling that centralized government was still developing, large gatherings, audiences might attract the wrong sort. Some of the accusations and concerns from local and regional administrative bodies included riots, disease, immorality, and traffic jams. There might be insurrection if there were large gatherings of people, and disease. And people with no visible means of supporting themselves, like players, must surely be thieves and vagabonds. In 1575, the mayor of London banished all players from the city and pulled down performance spaces. This had the lovely effect of increasing business in those performance spaces outside the city's jurisdiction. In June 1580, the Lord Mayor obtained an act against the plague to redress of such things as are found dangerous in spreading the infection and otherwise drawing God's wrath and plague upon the city, such as the erection and frequenting of infamous houses in the judication of the city, and the drawing of people from the service of God and exercise to unchaste plays. So this is a far cry from the Mystery, Miracle, Morality plays reception, which were sanctioned by all local organizations such as the guild, the parish, the church structure. As playing companies developed within and under the patronage of noble and aristocratic houses, the royal household was no different, and it was the Lord Chamberlain's job to book the Queen's men to entertain the Queen. A bored monarch is no fun. A bored, well-educated, intellectually curious, multilingual monarch is especially unpleasant. In the 1570s and 80s, the Chamberlain did not use his own company for court entertainments, although members of his company did join the official company for these performances. We must remember that Robert Dudley Leicester was still alive. Although by 1586, the Lord Chamberlain, Henry Carey, Baron Hunsdon, and his son-in-law's company, the Lord Admiral's men, performed together at court at least once during the Christmas season. And this is part of the transition from individual household companies to what eventually became two dominant companies, nearly national in scope and reputation. And then we get to 1594. This is a pivotal year in the development of English theater. And you want the really good news? We have no Privy Council records for August 1593 to October 1595. This means that the leading government authority over players and theaters is silent to our inquiries. As a result, we have to use as many alternate sources as possible and to conjecture, a skill historians are artists at. But this is what we do know. The London theater scene and court entertainments are now the province of Queen Elizabeth's half-brother cousin Henry Carey and his son-in-law Charles Howard. Her closest friend is Howard's wife and Carey's daughter, Catherine Carey Howard. And there is a gaggle of daughters, granddaughters, nieces, and nephews serving in all aspects of the government. And we no longer have the monopoly on court performances that the Queen's men had, but we have a duopoly instead run by her family. Andrew Gurst argues that the creation in 1594 of the duopoly, jointly given exclusive access for some years to court and to regular London playing, was not a matter of market forces, but was a Privy Council fiat, engineered by Carey and Howard. This makes Shakespeare players more creatures of serious political patronage than many would wish to allow. To top it off, for the late Elizabethan period, the office, the key administrative office for theater, was the Office of the Revels, which was overseen by the Master of the Revels, Edmund Tilney, who was another relation of both the Lord Admiral and the Lord Chamberlain as a distant Howard cousin. You may remember him as Simon Callow in Shakespeare in Love. Was there a struggle between the City of London and centralized government, i.e. the Privy Council and the monarch? Or was it just the family taking care of business? And can we actually decipher those two, or is that the same thing? Carey and Howard, both patrons of acting companies, both on the Privy Council, both with large affinities in Parliament, both with wives and daughters who spent their days with the Queen, both with hard-headed practical sense, would have known that the incoming mayor was against theater within city boundaries. And it is possible that this change in 1594 was a preemptive strike against city authority overreach. By removing the playing to the environs, dissolving the Queen's men, and creating two companies directly under their personal authority, the city would not be able to interfere with central government or Privy Council activity, even down to like entertaining the Queen. And in 1598, a Privy Council order forbid other companies from playing in the vicinity, thus maintaining the duopoly. Carey and Howard were fine with handing the mayor a hollow victory and consenting to a ban on playing inside the city. They merely sent their companies off to play in the suburbs. And confining playing to the suburbs of Middlesex and Surrey would keep it out of the Lord Mayor's jurisdiction and conveniently under Howard, who was a Lord Lieutenant of these suburban areas. So we've got playing, it's an easy commuting distance, touring as appropriate, also playing within the court, crowding out any other noble or aristocratic families dominating court performances. especially as the Earl of Leicester's company died shortly after he did, although his widow, Lettice Knowles, also a member of the Carey kinship network, kept it going for a brief time, just as Alice Spencer with Strange's Men had done. Competition for the Queen's attention at court was now contained to her non-royal family. And this is just some brief court schedules showing the dominance of these companies at court, just to make this point on how much they controlled this. So the Carey advantage. Court performances brought prestige and payment. Public performances brought profit. It was estimated that 15 to 20,000 people comprised the weekly theater attendance in London, which at the time had a population of approximately 200,000. I haven't spent too much time with the touring companies, but that also allows for extending goodwill, expressing important fact finding, spying if you want, economic engine work, all sorts of fun stuff, as well as avoiding the plague. But for a final pondering thought, when we watch Hamlet struggle with revenge and legitimacy, we're watching the end point of a half-century evolution. Theater moved from pulpit to marketplace to court, but it never stops preaching. And the Careys understood this and demanded control of the audience's attention, whether it be their cousin the Queen or the people of England. They turned humanistic commercial theater into a family business that served art, profit, and power simultaneously. That's not just theatrical history, that's early modern media strategy in service of a family who helped run the government. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yay, Kristin.
Everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
informative. Very
Thank you.
informative.
Very nice.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, SAR, for inviting me.
Thank you, Michael.
Great.
Yeah,
You all agree.
thank you.